welcome everybody. We've got a small audience today, I think, unless a lot more people join, so we can keep this tight. And if you have questions, please share them throughout. We'll try to address them, and obviously we're going to have a Q&A at the end. What we're going to be talking about today is thinking about the right learning mix as you build your ethics and compliance programs. Um, when to use off the shelf, when to customize off the shelf, when to build bespoke. We've got a panelists to join us here, and we'll move into our introductions. Move forward there, Carol. So who are you talking to now? I'm Paul Howe. I head up the client success teams in North America. I'll give you a little bit of a background on my experience and date myself a bit here. I've been in the learning space since the late 80s, early 90s. Started as an instructional designer, developer, managed operational content teams in a bespoke learning organization for many, many years, and joined LRN in 2020, which was my first foray into the licensed content model. Um, in the latter part of my career, I've been more on the client sales side of the business, but I'm going to wear my instructional design hat today as we talk through some of these considerations as you're looking at your building your E&C program from a content perspective. And joining us today, and I'll have Elise introduce herself, is Elise Phillips from Integra. And Elise, if you could say a few words about your experience and what Integra does and what your role is there, that'd be great.
Thanks, Paul. Happy to be here today. Hi, everyone. My name is Elise Phillips, and I develop the Global Compliance Training Program at Integra Life Sciences. Integra Life Sciences is a global leader in medical technology, and we provide various solutions in surgical, neurologic, and regenerative care. I've been with Integra for 2 years this upcoming February, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Elise. Carol, if you can move forward. So as part of our agenda today, we've gone through the welcome and introductions. We're going to start off with a poll question. We're then going to talk about some content options. We're going to give some overviews, present you with some decision models and questions you can ask internally as you're making decisions. We'll move into additional panel and audience poll questions. And then for some of those things that we talked about in the decision models, we'll do a deeper dive in considerations regarding instructional design components, AI, tools you might be considering using or considering using, and decisions on deciding which tools, and then measurement. And then we'll end with a Q&A to close. So let's move forward. I think we're starting. Well, actually, before we get to a poll question, I want to just give a high level picture here. We're going to, as I mentioned earlier, talk about content today. But when you look at building a culture and a high impact ethics and compliance program, it goes beyond just content. So it really starts with leadership. Culture is built every day by the decisions leaders make throughout the organization. But then there's many, many tools within a ethics and compliance program that are options to use. We've listed some of the ones that we provide. You may have others, but there's things like Hotline, which is for us, it's voice. There's how do we train our suppliers, phishing simulations, and how do we address cybersecurity risk, policy management for all the policies we have internally. What's our code look like? Is it digitized? Is it in a PDF format? And do we measure culture through surveys? Analytics, many folks have their own learning management system. We do as well, but what's actually being tracked with those analytics, and how is the program being measured? Disclosures, assessment, competency assessments, a whole slew of different tools and solutions that can be used to build a high impact program. But again, today we're going to focus on content and deciphering between when it's appropriate to use library content, when it's appropriate to highly customize content, and when it's appropriate to build bespoke, whether that's internal or whether you use a supplier that's sourced to a bespoke supplier. So if you would move forward, Carol. Now is our poll question. So the folks here that have joined, how many organizations use a combination? So we've broken down the responses. Do you use licensed content from a supplier completely out of the box? Do you customize your library only? So you're 100% library, but you customize it heavily. Do you use a combination of customized and bespoke? And are you a bespoke only organization where everything you build is internal or sourced through a supplier? And we'll give a moment for everybody here to answer.
We still have some trickling in, so let's just give it a few more seconds.
Sure. Okay. So it's great. The majority are using a combination of, and it looks like nobody's bespoke only. So that's great because we do believe optimal program is a combination of both. So if you close that, move forward, Carol. So we just asked a question on the three different content paths, but here's some vocabulary that can be used to just make sure we're all level set on what it means. Licensed library, used out of the box is something that you're paying a supplier for. You're licensing the intellectual property. Um, some of the audience here answered they'll just take that content and it applies as is and roll that out to their particular audiences. More so in this particular audience, and I would say across our customer base and what we see in the industry is taking that license IP and customizing it. And the reason for that is context, well, obviously brand. You want to have it customized at least to a minimum of your brand. But customizing the content further, and by that I mean maybe modifying the policies, maybe modifying the scenarios is important because context uh, and relevance increases the learning. So your likelihood of making sure that those learners are engaged and retaining what it is that's being trained and practicing the skills that you expect them to practice increases dramatically when you provide relevant context to the learner. Then on the bespoke, that is built to own. So you build that internally. You source it to somebody. It's your content. Maybe it's specific policies, scenarios. Maybe you want a specific design, but that's what we mean by a bespoke build. So as we talk further, we're going to talk about those considerations, but I just want to make sure that we level set on the definitions of each. As we talk about learning, this is just another kind of high level focusing us on our conversation here. There's a lot of different content types that can be addressed with library content or bespoke. You see those over on the left-hand side of the screen. We're going to focus on E&C, but everything we're really talking about today applies to whether you're thinking about health and safety library, whether you're thinking about sales training, leadership training, typically stuff like operations and tech and manufacturing is going to be more specific, and it's going to be harder to find library licensed content for that. That'll probably be more bespoke. But a lot of those content areas do have library content out there available. And so what we're talking about applies to all. And then when we think about learning, it involves a lot of different modalities. So we could have instructor-led content, virtual instructor-led content, videos and animations that sit on their own, infographics, all of that's great because it increases the learner effect if we deliver learning over time with multiple assets. But today we're going to focus on what are the decision points as we build out our learning courseware, and that may also involve micro learning courses as well. So that'll be our focus for the conversation as we move forward. Now, the premise as we talk about some of these things is to think about um, is let's not think about choosing one particular model. Let's create some decisions for the entire curriculum that we're looking at. So it's about a learner effectiveness, not the format preference. So we're not just saying we prefer. Now this actually happens. Some organizations, none on this phone call, apparently are doing just bespokes, but some organizations have a bespoke only strategy. It is a format preference. It's probably also a financial preference, and relates to the maturity of their L&D groups. But the learning effectiveness should be the key driver. Matching the content to the risk, the goals, the business drivers, the learning outcomes that you're expecting should be the primary driver. The maturity of the program changes the answers to some of the questions as we see as we're going to talk a little bit more here today. As the program matures, things like advanced measurement come into play. Tool knowledge and experience come into play. But again, if we can drive our decisions based on what we're trying to accomplish from a behavior perspective, everything else kind of falls into play. And as I stated earlier, when reviewing the poll questions, the optimal model typically is a mix. It's a mix of using library courses out of the box sometimes for scale and speed to market. It's the customization to create that relevance and improve learning. And then there's also a mix of times where we're going to choose to build something bespoke for unique risks. And here's a model you can think about as you're making some of those decisions. On the left axis, we've got the impact and the consequence of failure. So for business critical initiatives, if people do things wrong, I would put that in that's a high impact consequence, and therefore we want the learning to be higher impact. We want people to pay attention. We want people to get something out of it. We want to be able to measure it. On the bottom axis, we've got what's the risk and content specificity, if I can say that correctly. So on the left-hand side, you see it's just generic. It's very common. On the right-hand side, it's specific. We've got some internal policies that just aren't covered by a library. So if we look at we're going to move left to right on the bottom up. On the lower part of the axis, low impact. It's very generic content. Well, that's probably a decision point where you might say, well, listen, if I can find the right content fit in a library, that's probably my best play. Let's just get that out there. There's low impact to the business. I don't need to do a bunch of customization, and it's just going to be good if I can get that to market quickly. Over to the right, then would be oops, I'm sorry if you can go back, Carol. Over to the right, then would be okay. We're still kind of on that lower tier of an impact perspective, but we want more organization specific content. That's your customized library. So we're customizing things like brand and maybe some high level things like imagery, but not super customized. So again, you're going to get to market quickly when you do something like that. Now, if we're talking about things that are going to impact our business highly, we're up on the left hand side to the top left, where we're customizing more parts of the library content. Scenarios that are applicable. Maybe we actually do role profiles where we actually have specific content per roles in the content to make sure, again, it's contextual to that learner. And then the top right would be bespoke. It's going to be super highly customized to the point where we're going to use our own IP. This is high stakes behavior changes involved in this. We don't have, again, in a library, we can't find the policies, but it's on the higher scale on both of those things. It's high impact, but it's also very, very organization specific. That will probably always lend itself to a bespoke build. A little different way to look at that. On the left, just some bullet points on when to use library, when to use bespoke. On the library front, the risk areas are there. They're in a library. I can find it. Customization is easy. So I can either self-serve myself and customize it, or I can source it out to the library supplier, and it's very easy, and I can get it done cost effectively and get it to market quickly. I think thinking about the shelf life of the training is important. Do we need variety? If we actually use library, we don't want to deliver the same training year after year after year. So customization becomes important in that regard, or working with a supplier that actually is providing new content and fresh content. If the learner experiences the same thing year after year, even if it's just changing scenarios, you're going to lose them, and you're going to lose their engagement, and you're going to lose the effectiveness of what you're providing the business. Content and regulations change often. That's another critical factor. How do we actually maintain the content over time? If regulations are changing, do we have internal horizon monitoring? Monitoring? Do we have internal SMEs that actually can review it to make sure we're actually have the proper governance? Assuming we do, well, actually, if you don't, it would lend itself more to library, is what I'm trying to say there. On the bespoke side, obviously, if the risk area is not there and you can't find it with suppliers in the space, then you're looking at building it. So that's company specific policies or procedures. If you find yourself customizing library, and this is just a ballpark, but if you're leaning over 60 to 70% of the contents being heavily customized, that might push it to a bespoke model where it makes more sense to actually build the content from the ground up and own it. If you want to own the content, that's obviously a critical factor. What's the maturity of the L&D departments? what are the tool standards? Some organizations require specific tools to be used within the organization, which would lead to a bespoke solution. So here's another tool that you can use as you're making some decisions, a little bit of a scorecard. So taking the different criteria, some of those that I just mentioned on that previous slide. And I won't go through all these. I'll just touch on a few of them. But what's the content fit? I just talked about that. If it's existing, that's library. If it fits, but we've got some context missing. Customization fits. If we don't have an adequate course, that's a bespoke. Um, let's talk about business consequences. If all we're trying to do is create awareness, and that's that low impact slide that I talked about earlier, then something out of the box, off the shelf, is the quickest, most inexpensive way to address that. If the business consequence moves up that scale, and now we've got potential fines that the business could face. I'll take it out of E and C for a moment. Let's say we're trying to increase sales. Well, that's a big number for an organization. If the training better increase the sales, then we're going to deliver training. So that gets to wanting to customize what that library would be. And if it's super high stakes, and there's huge business impact, as there is for much of the E&C risk areas, then then either we need to make sure that our customized library has the right levels of design to address that, or we may need to actually build some bespoke solutions to address that. Speed and cost are a consideration. I'll skip down to the bottom one. I'll just add some caution here. That tends to be a big driver these days, in many organizations. But when you think about that in a vacuum, it can cause a problem. We've seen a lot of organizations, and we're going to talk about AI tools later, but we've seen a lot of organizations start to adopt some internal AI tools with that push to get to market quicker and reduce the costs. But when you don't look at all these other considerations that we're providing here, that could cause a problem. You could create a training solution that bores the learner to tears, which will be a huge problem for the business if it's a high stakes initiative. And so we'll give you some considerations as we think about that. But those are some things on speed and cost. Again, if we need rapid rollout and the awareness level training is appropriate, and then it's okay. We can roll something out, either a low cost bespoke program or a low cost library program. So this is just a decision scorecard to give you some ideas on things you can think about internally as you make these decisions. Okay, so with that said, Elise, I'm going to turn it back to you. I know you make these decisions probably on a daily, monthly, weekly, quarterly basis. What are some of the things? Well, first of all, are you a mixture of license and bespoke? And if the answer to that is yes, what considerations are you guys thinking about when you make the proper mix and build out your program?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So we are a mix of licensed and bespoke content. And one of the first things that we're looking at when we're deciding between the licensed or the bespoke content is really the risk factor. How much risk is there to the organization, or more specifically, whatever business unit we're looking at? And is it an Integra specific policy? There's a lot of great library content that we've been able to adapt and to customize to kind of get to that middle of the road, if you will. But then when we look at, is the policy something we want to give them examples based on our products, how they're interacting in the field, for example? That's when we typically are leaning more towards bespoke. And that's really the decision tree I'm going through probably on a weekly to monthly basis, to decide on our training program.
Thanks, thanks, Elise. Just out of curiosity, I'm coming out of the blue on this one for you, may not be prepared, but what would you say the mix is ballpark for you guys?
I'd say right now we're at about 60% bespoke and then maybe 30 to 40% licensed. And then we probably have about 10% that is neither, it's not in the module format.
Sure.
It's
Okay,
a different style of learning. Yeah.
great, thank you. Okay, poll question back to the group as we're going to go into some deeper dive into some specific areas, i.e. instructional design. So how many people on this call either have an instructional design role or background, or leverage internal L&D teams. So your options are no instructional design background, or you don't really have a learning team to support you. You actually are an instructional designer yourself, or you, while you're not a learning professional, you have the support of a mature L&D team. And you could answer that third one even if it's not a mature L&D team. Okay, 40% no design background or help. 27% are designers, and then 33% are not designers, but they have support from design folks within their organization. So next we're gonna talk about some design considerations. So for the ones that are not designers, we'll keep it high level, but I think there's some key takeaways that you can take away as you're talking to some of your leadership within your organization, or as you're working with your L&D teams within your organization. So if you go to the next slide there, Carol, I think we have one more poll, another poll question. So we're going to also talk about in this part of the presentation, we're going to talk about measurement. And so this is a short question on how do you measure your program internally. So I know measurement goes far beyond this, and we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about it. But do you measure just completions only for your NC program, or do you try to go beyond that and measure impact using metrics such as culture surveys, long-term retention, might be some follow-up assessments of folks, or additional training throughout the year. Do you measure training time? Some organizations are really looking at training time, and if we can reduce the training footprint while not sacrificing quality and output, that's important to the business. Do we measure hotline? So one of those two selections. So pretty split, 44 and 56. Elise brought up a good point as we were talking about earlier. Some of this, the reason folks may decide on some of these selections would be the maturity of the organization, the maturity of the program, and where things are today. So a quick question, I don't have a follow-up poll, but just a quick question to those that answered we measure completions only. How many of you have either been talking internally or a desire to go beyond that and just aren't there yet? So there's a desire to go beyond that. If you could just do some reactions with hand claps, or I don't know what our options are, hand claps or love or whatever. Or is your business good with just measuring the completions?
And then Paul, it looks like in the chat we've got some folks that are sharing about hitting basic requirements. That's why the focus is completion right now.
Okay. Got it. Okay, so I think there is, typically when talking with organizations or working with organizations, everybody's at a different stage of the development of their program. While that may be the case, we're measuring completions only. That may always be the case. That's just the nature of the business. But a lot of organizations are looking to go further. So we'll talk about what it means to measure more in depth and how you might do that. So if you could go forward here. So some instructional design considerations as you're thinking about low impact and high impact. Now, the bullets on this slide, again, are text heavy. You're going to get this in a recording, in a blog post, so you can go through and use some of this. But to get to a high impact learning solution, and when I say high impact, that's the learners are engaged. They're not just flipping through the screens and clicking the right arrow as quick as they can to get to an assessment. They're paying attention. They're going to retain the knowledge that you're trying to partake. But more importantly, it's the do aspect. What do we expect them to do to live and breathe the culture that we expect within our business? And to do that, you've really got to, as I mentioned earlier, you got to create contextual learning. It's got to be relevant to them. You've got to create realistic practice, and that comes through different levels of scenarios, or even game-based type level scenarios and simulations where you're having people practice. The best case example to draw that outside of even learning is You think about phishing simulations. A lot of folks, a lot of organizations do phishing simulations. So they do training on cybersecurity, data breach, data protection. But throughout the year, you're getting pinged with, examples of how the fraudsters are coming at us. And that practice is really what drives home the ability for learners to actually catch phishing examples and stop it and stop breaches within organizations. So practice is very and very important as part of a higher level program. Authentic context, I mentioned, realistic consequences. So how you actually deliver feedback is important within a solution, not just no, Johnny, you got it wrong, try again. But what are the consequences as you make decisions and you don't identify risk properly, or when maybe you've identified a risk properly, but you don't know what to do with it. You don't know where to roll it up within the organization. Those things are all consequential. So providing that within the training and giving the learner experience is important. And that leads to a really high impactful program from a learning perspective. And again, as we talked about earlier, that's the kind of learning that you want to put in place when the impacts and consequences, as Elise, you said, as you make your considerations, is high for the business. Now, if it's low impact, we don't need to consider those things on the left-hand side of the screen. We can get and use a tool like Synthesia, which we're going to talk about in a bit, to just create a chat GPT script of something we want to create awareness on within our organization and have a video or talking ahead with some slides to go through to explain it, because the impact of the business is low. We know the learning probably is going to be fairly low, but we're at least creating an awareness level of training for the organization.
Hey, Paul, maybe to add here, it just struck an chord. I was in a conversation with a cross-functional partner who has a background in instructional design, and he brought up a really good point that, a lot of the folks on the call today and in this setting, we're focusing on the ethics and compliance piece of this. But there's a whole work stream of training happening, I'm sure, across all of our organizations, that isn't just ethics and compliance. So when we think through instructional design, kind of making sure everyone is together on it. We're designing modules in the same way. We maybe are using the same instructional design techniques and principles so that learning becomes very familiar for the learner, and we're kind of taking the guesswork of how do I navigate this? How is information being presented out of the way as the learner is absorbing the information? And so then they're going to absorb more of the information, not just in ethics compliance, but also say maybe in sales or manufacturing. So kind of standardizing that across the learning and development of your organizations will help get to that high impact instructional design at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, and I'll take it a step further. Though all those different content areas that you mentioned, and I had that slide up earlier, where on the left-hand side of the screen we talked about that. If you think about ethics and compliance, all the training in those other content areas should have ethics and compliance and culture properly communicated throughout all other training, which makes it important to have these internal discussions that you're having, like you have, at least across functional groups. So in businesses, as I've grown up in my career, and sometimes it's cyclical, sometimes it's just the way businesses are, but there's very decentralized learning, sometimes there's centralized. Um, Even in a decentralized model, it's important to have councils or ways to communicate across those functional groups, to your point, at least, to make sure that we're actually putting in the right instructional models, decisions, points across the organization. And as we look at some of those key terms that we just looked at on the screen, this is just another way to look at it. We have a model when we're working with customization or doing bespoke project with organizations, and you'll find in the learning industry, if you went to do some searching on levels of interactivity or levels of instructional design, um, companies use the level 1, the level 2, the level 3, level 4, sometimes level 5, and they all have typically definitions that go with that. On the lower end, on the level 1 side, um, reiterating what we talked about before, that's awareness level. We just want somebody to know the standard. Typically, that can be a passive interactive solution. It could be a video. We were just watching a video. And then as you move up that scale, you're adding more and more components. On the far end of the scale, level four, that's something that's probably got gamification in, real high-end media, real high-end video to really try to capture the learner, engage them in concepts or skills or um, practice, as I mentioned earlier, having folks practice. And that's for when you're driving that performance. You want people to retain the knowledge. You want them 6 months from now, not 5 minutes after the training. 6 months from now, you want them putting into practice what it is you expect them to be doing on their job. All right. So another question for you, Elise. How does impact play in some of the decisions you're making and the type of training that you do employ? You talked about it, I think, in your initial answer, but maybe you could talk a little bit further about what does impact mean? Is it the consequences of potential fines, hotline increase, and what's the impact? Because I think you did mention earlier you do consider impact as it relates to your decisions. But what are some of those criterias of impact that you're thinking about?
Yeah, when we think of impact, I'm really thinking of risk and then ease of learning to mitigate that risk. And then also the environment in which the learner is taking the training. So those are kind of the three spaces that I'm playing in when I'm deciding, okay, how are we creating this content? How are we rolling it out to the learner? And that drastically will affect the decision on if we're using a library course or if we're using bespoke content or if we're going to gravitate towards a micro learning. Or maybe it's simple enough to read a policy or have a one pager. And that really affects or is affected by the environment on which the learner is taking the training. So for us, when I look at, for an example, an impact in our risk area with our sales team, we know that a lot of our sales team, they're not sitting down at a computer at a desk, either in their home or in an office to do the training. So we need to make sure that we're delivering the training in a way that captures those big risk areas. And in most cases, that lends us to bespoke content because we really want to customize what we're seeing as the biggest risks in whatever policy or procedure or cultural behavior that we're looking to roll out to them. Same concept goes with if we're delivering training company wide. We have a lot of folks who are on the floor. And so if they're coming off the floor at their manufacturing site at a shared workstation, what information are we presenting to them that is going to have the biggest impact on where the risk is for their area? So really focusing on what instructional design method am I using to make sure that the risk is identified, it's captured, and they're learning it for their specific area of the business. A lot easier said than done, but we've been
Yeah.
able to use a mix of that bespoke content and the library content that you guys are putting out to achieve that.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to segue into talking about AI here for a moment. And I think we'll close with measurement, if I recall correctly. So for AI, how many organizations are using AI tools today to develop your own bespoke courses? Um, so we use it. We're building our own bespoke courses, and we're not using AI to build bespoke courses. I should have had in here maybe one that we're just embarking or looking to, but we'll keep it to two for today. So I think this is probably for go back to poll question one, it'd be for the middle tier that was saying that they do customization, a combination of customization, library and bespoke.
Okay.
Okay. So the majority is not. So we're going to just touch on, this could be a whole nother topic, and we'll have other topics in our webinar series. But we'll just touch on some of the considerations when using AI tools and some ideas on some of the tools that are out there today. So when you're thinking about it using AI, it for sure accelerates the work and reduces the speed to market, can reduce the cost. But always consider what what the governance is, what's the legal review, and that relates, I think, to the risk as well. So for those high risk areas that you're talking about, Elise, you really got to be considerate of if I'm going to create an AI course using an AI tool, it's great, I can do it quickly, but what additional risk am I increasing to the business by doing that? And do I have mechanisms to reduce that risk? So some of the things to think about is on the validation side, um, have mechanisms in play where you can actually have SME review or horizon monitoring built in. How are we going to keep up with the legal updates? For things that are of high risk and that change often legally. What's the mechanism in play that I can build into my process if I'm going to use AI tools? Don't discard all the design discussions we've had and the things that Elise has mentioned. Some AI tools out there right now are great at speed to market and low cost, as I mentioned, but is it really driving towards a value-driven design and considering risk? Um, don't sacrifice continual innovation. Now, in theory, anybody building an AI tool better be building a lot of innovation as they evolve their tool. But we've seen some organizations using some tools that are just kind of locking them into a certain design methodology, um, which then you're kind of stuck. I mean, and you don't have the ability to make those important decisions on what things should be low impact, what things should be high impact. We talked about the importance of instructional design and make sure that there's data insights coming out of it. So some of the tools out there I think are they're in their infancy, and while they have a tool built to deliver learning, maybe there's not the data insights needed to actually properly measure whether you're actually getting something out of the training or not. So just some considerations as AI is evolving rapidly, but this gives you some decision points to think about as you're evolving and as other AI companies and suppliers are evolving. I mentioned we would just expose you to some tools. So most of the folks here haven't started, but here there's a whole slew of tools coming into the market for creating learning, and we've got some media tools in there, like on the right hand side. And by the way, we use some of these too because we build bespoke solutions, and we use some of these to build our library solution. Um, so on the right hand side, you've got HeyGen, 11 Labs, so a bunch of media type tools. On the top of the screen, Synthesia is something that we're hearing a lot about in the space. Um, Apologize, my icon's small there. Articulate is another one. A lot of organizations are using Articulate as a tool. Our tools actually have some AI built into it as well. That's why I put the design tool here. Um, Photoshop has AI technologies built into it now to create imagery quicker and faster. Again, this is a whole large topic, and I think I can't remember, Carol, if it's on our docket to explore, but if not, we'll try to get it on our roadmap for a webinar where we can give more exposure to what's out there. But as you embark on it, I think the most important takeaway is to think about what's the effect of me using these tools, and don't reduce the impact of your learning at the expense of, actually the other way around, at the expense of reducing my cost. Don't reduce the learning impact is the key takeaway I think for today. And then I think this is our closing piece, but when we talk about measurement, most folks are not measuring to the levels here. And this is a model out there that many I think probably won't be familiar here because I think there wasn't a ton of instructional designers, but there's a leader in the space on measurement out there. He's been in the space forever, uh, beyond my age that I told you that I was really old when we started this introduction. But Kirkpatrick evaluation model, and at the base, so there's different ways that this model is deployed, but you can do a search on it, and it would be, I think, interesting for you to take a look at. On the lowest level is just reaction. So that is a learner assessment. So what did the learner feel this was relevant? Did they think it was meaningful to them? So that's a post learning learner assessment. And all these data points are important, by the way. I'm not discounting any of them, but that gives you just did the learner think it was useful to them or not? That's a key data point. If they didn't think it was useful, they'd probably not get anything out of it. If they did think it was useful, it tells you that the learning was good, It doesn't necessarily tell you whether the learner are actually going to retain the information and do the things you want them to do. As you move further down that, if you were to measure the results, so I'll take it outside of E and C, as I did earlier with sales training, if we're trying to do training to increase the amount of sales and revenue our sales team is producing, the learner satisfaction survey doesn't tell us that. Whether our sales numbers goes up or not tells us that. Now, to determine whether learning has actually had the effect on that or not, there's a lot of other factors. But there are ways to measure each of these things in more depth and move down that pyramid, if you will, to get a better idea of how your program is providing impact to the business. So, for instance, you could do a culture survey that goes a bit further. What do people feel about our culture as a whole? That's another data point. You could measure several months after you've delivered training. So that gets to, are people retaining the information? That's that learning middle tier one. We all have knowledge assessments and tests and scenarios within our training in the moment, but studies have been shown that if you actually um, assess somebody immediately after they've taken the training, people will score similar if they've had poor learning or good or very well designed learning. If you measure them 3 to 6 months after they've taken a training, you'll see a drastic difference between poorly designed training and good design training. So maybe there's a mechanism to build some assessments into your program on a periodic basis. It's tough because you're increasing the training footprint of the business. So you have to pick your key spots where you want to do that. But this is a model where you can look at how do we actually measure across the business whether our learning is effective or not.
Yeah, Paul, and I think good to add here to it in that learning piece of the model, and you touched on it a bit, is really hearing from the business, hearing from the learners. What kind of learning did they like taking? If you like taking a certain learning, you're going to be more apt to do it and to enjoy it and to retain that information. We actually brought a group cross-functionally together to take a look at different options for training modules that were across different library content, different options in the library content, such as gamification, different ways bespoke courses were built. And we got their thoughts and opinions on, do I like this? Does this make sense to me? How's the navigation? Do I open this? Am I confused? Am I anxious? Or am I excited about learning? And the insights were incredibly helpful as we were designing where we were going in terms of either building new bespoke content or using different libraries to develop it. So not being afraid to have those candid conversations and bring them into the process. Most folks here are in ethics and compliance. Our training is not optional. So how can we encourage the business to be involved in it? We all have to take it. So let's find some enjoyment in taking those trainings.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, at least because again, that leads to the context of the learner, right? And you're going to have a higher effect on the back end of it. That something we're looking at is not in our libraries today, but is how to create those options and have them available. So it's a deployment issue, right? How are we going to deploy that? But if you had several different options of learning where people could pick the style of learning that's best for them and be sure that each of those have the high impact that you want, or the right impact, I should say, per the business need, that's a model that we're thinking about as well,
Yeah.
and actually trying to formalize that within the product lines. But it's super you're having those conversations, and it sounds like it's super meaningful because the learners are thinking about that too.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited for the improvements you guys are making for the different learning styles. I think that'll be really impactful for not just us, but other folks on the call as well.
Yeah, I think we're creating all those modalities, but then the thought needs to go into how do we deploy those?
Mhm.
Can we deploy them as options where a learner can pick one, or do we roll out one baseline option and then we provide all the other ones as optional? I mean, there's a lot to think through all that, but
Yeah.
but I think it is an important piece and will help create more impact for businesses. Okay, then the final thing I did forget about this piece is just some considerations when you're thinking about bespoke builds versus library builds, just from a cost perspective. Um, and I haven't captured everything here, but on the bespoke side, you got to think about what's the cost of the build, what's my internal labor, what's my external sourcing costs. Think about it on a per asset basis. Um, some organizations don't think about the fully loaded cost because they're already set resources and you don't have to really factor that in. I know one organization, I know one of the leaders we were talking about with said the company's pushing to bring everything internal and build it bespoke because it doesn't cost anything. Well, that's actually not true. It costs something because there's people that you're paying for to build it. But the reason the leaders are thinking that is it's sunk costs, it's employees we already have. But I think to build a true financial model, you do want to look at the cost of the build per asset. What's our loaded costs? What's it going to cost us to maintain it or rebuild the asset? Um, what's the speed to market we want? What's the translation costs? What's the cost of the SME review on the library? Um, what's the cost? What's my license cost per asset? What's the customization cost? Because as we talked about earlier, it's probably important to customize many of the courses because you want it relevant to the learner. What's the language license cost? So those are just some considerations on the cost basis, right? We talked about impact and other design discussions, but if you're looking purely at cost and try not to do that just in a vacuum, but and think about those other things we've mentioned. But these are the cost things you should be also considering. And I think, Carol, it brings us to our end. I don't know if we had any questions in the chat that we need to address, but does anybody have any further questions? Or I would state, do you have any other recommendations for follow-up in specific areas that we've talked about?
I think one of the questions that we got over the Q&A section is, have you ever regretted building something custom instead of buying it?
Um,
Or something of the like, I guess.
yeah. Elise, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a great question. And I think for me and for us at Integra, one of the important takeaways is at that point in time, what was the best decision for the organization given the information that was available? Um, we know that not only LRN, but other content providers are expanding their library offerings based on what they hear from customers and from the industry of we need this type of training. So maybe at the point in time, you needed to build a bespoke course because there wasn't library content available. And maybe 5 years down the line, now there is library content available. So I think no regrets. But at the point in time where you were making the decision, did you make the right decision at that point in time? And you will always have that bespoke content. I mean, you built it, it's yours, it doesn't go anywhere. And can maybe you improve it for a different cost setup than you would maybe use licensed material? But great question and something, yeah, definitely to think
Yeah,
about.
I'll talk about it. Just in some of my experience, even going back into when I worked for a bespoke organization for a long time. I don't know if there was necessary regrets of building a bespoke solution, but it relates to our impact questions. Building the right solution for the right need. So I experienced many times organizations driving towards a lower cost solution, which wasn't appropriate because the impact to the business was high. So we probably in those cases sometimes built poorer learning, driving towards a budget and a time stamp to get the product out, when in fact what should have been built should have been higher level training because the impact of the business was big. That applies to deciding whether you're going to build library or bespoke as well. I will also say that we're seeing in the space some regrets. So we're seeing organizations gravitate to some of these AI tools right now to get something out done, get something again out to the market quicker and cheaper because management's striving to reduce budgets. Um, but the reality is they have found then the learners are not enjoying the learning experience. They're getting that feedback. They realize they're not getting the impact they need, and they're now coming back saying, maybe we need something higher level than that. And that could be a higher level bespoke solution. That could be a library solution that's customized to be more relevant and has the right instructional design in it. So we're seeing some of that, and that's why we really wanted when we just touched on the AI, is to give you the considerations because just got to be careful on and think about, we've been driving it home here and Elise has been helping me, but really got to think about the impact and the risks and match up the right solution for that impact and risk. There's a question in the chat about management buy-in. That's tough. In my whole career, it's been a tough one because a lot of times management doesn't have the knowledge or the expertise of making those decisions, but they have a budget mindset. Let's just focus in on that. So to talk to management, to get buy-in, you've got to come to the table and speak their language. So you got to put some financially modeling together, and you can't get deep into instructional design type stuff. Even though I was high level, I probably got deeper than maybe I should have today. You can't talk that lingo. You've got to talk about what's that risk? What's the impact to the business? Whether that's financial, it helps if it's financial, right? We could have this experience and it's going to be awful for our business, our brand, or we're going to get fined, whatever it is. If you can prove out that there's high risk to the business, and then talk about what the cost implications are for each of the different types of solutions you can put in place to solve that, you might find more money in budgets. So it's a higher level discussion, and if you need any help with positioning, we just talked to one of our clients that they had a drive from management to use AI to build everything internally, to build it cheaply, to build it inexpensively, and they knew that wasn't the right thing because the risk was super high to the business, and so they wanted some talking points on how to go talk to management, and it actually worked. Management, funded them higher than they thought they were going to be funded and got them the right types of learning solutions, which was a combination, by the way, of library, customized, and bespoke, to match their risk profile. So if you need any help with that, by the way, my email is at the beginning of this presentation, which will be shared. Feel free to reach out anytime, and we can help with some of those discussions.
Oh, maybe to add to that, I know you touched on the financial piece of management buy-in, but there's also the time savings piece that you can definitely translate into a financial metric depending on the part of the business. We've found that justifying we can create this bespoke, it's going to save 10, 15 minutes on training time versus the existing training that's being used to mitigate that risk area. Compiling those time-saving metrics. How much are we decreasing training time by the investment that you're giving our program, is a huge win across pretty much every area of the organization. It frees up more time for the learner to work on their specific role, or maybe additional training to enhance the program, mitigate additional risks, et cetera.
Yeah, no, that's huge. And a lot of our clients are using some of the benchmark data to look at that, right? What's our training footprint as a whole? Because ethics and compliance is one piece of the training that everybody experiences, right? And so you do need to be considerate of that. The one thing I would add to that is that as you look to reduce the training footprint, don't sacrifice the quality of the learning as you do that, right? So there's a risk that you could say, I want to take a 30-minute course down to a 5-minute course. And it's still well designed on both sides, right? But are we losing something in the impact arena? So you got to make those decisions as you make that call. But it is huge what you just talked about, Lise. Organizations are measuring that, and there's a direct financial impact. When you say I've got 15,000 people taking 2 hours less training a year, that's a big number financially, and you can use that in some of the financial modeling. I think we're to the end.
Paul, I just dropped in one more question.
Are there any types of learning almost always deserving a bespoke approach versus types that are typically better suited off the shelf? It's a great question, Carol. My rule of thumb and the way I think about it is if we're training on a specific policy to Integra, where I want the learner to see our products or an example from the field as just an example talking through this question, I'm going to do bespoke. We've had some more specific policies come out in the last couple years where maybe there is a library course that could sort of fit it, but it's going to have a bigger impact and mitigate way more risk if I know that my learner can see the product it relates to, the scenario that they will probably experience, and then the correct way to handle that. I'm 100% going bespoke, and we make a great case for it when we're talking to leadership on the funding for something like that.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with that. I think that's a clear cut. That's a clear cut example of when you would do it. Oh, We've got one other thing that we'll leave you with. It's just some questions, questions to ask as you're scoping and deciding a path. I won't read all these. It'll be in the follow-up deck that you can get. We've asked them throughout this conversation, but it just kind of summarizes them. What's the consequence if the learner does something incorrectly? What are the audiences? As you talked about earlier, Elise, the different audiences and the types of learning styles. How much change I talked about that very early on. How much change do I need in that course for it to feel credible and useful? These are all decisions, and in closing on the bottom of the screen there, a good recommendation is going to explain why that content path fits the risk, and at least you've been driving that point home, and not just why it fits the budget. I think that brings us to our close. Again, if you have further questions, please feel free to reach out. We appreciate your time today and wish you a great rest of the week and weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Paul.
Yep. Thanks, Lisa. Much appreciated. Thanks, Carol.
Thank you.